Our second presenter is Dennis Erpelding, who's the Director of International Food Safety Standards and Policy at Elanco Animal Health, although Dennis is also Chairman of the Food and Agriculture Export Alliance in the US that accounts for about 40% of US agricultural exports amongst its members. So Dennis has got some experience both in terms of export of products, but also in the way that trade agreements and international regulations impact on the use of technology and the development of technology in agriculture. So I think for a slightly different angle, but certainly a very relevant issue from the point of view of agriculture in Australia, please welcome Dennis to the podium. Thank you.
Thanks, Mick, and delighted to be here and have a chance to visit with you this afternoon. I think as Hugh noted and as others noted, the importance of agricultural trade is well understood and recognized. But as we look at the importance of trade, what we call the not-so-obvious barriers restricting agricultural trade and enhanced productivity are very important to understand. We've gone through a lot of the trends today. I'll emphasize a few of those and really lead into the latter part about how do we get more proactive about thinking about where we need to go to make sure we keep facilitating agricultural trade in the process. Issues I'll touch on are global demand, productivity, innovation, agricultural trade, trade rules and standards, and ultimately innovation SPS policies. That latter part is the one that hopefully facilitates our success and achievement in the earlier parts. You've seen many numbers in many different ways. This just is another way of looking at the numbers, but if you look at annual growth and where that productivity is, the Asian markets, China, India at the top, you put the emerging markets, developing markets, Southeast Asia. Ideal location when you're sitting here in Australia and you think about where your opportunity is for agricultural exports from a global standpoint. But as much as you look at those numbers, you look at those locations, everyone else in the world looks at the same numbers, the same locations, and the Americas look at those as well. So there's a lot of opportunity, but also a lot of, you might say, competition to take advantage of the opportunity on a global basis. The good news is the market opportunity is probably greater than the supply opportunity in many ways. Here's the numbers we've seen from looking out at 2010 to 2050. The demand increases by sectors, but if you look at the dairy, the meats, the porcine, poultry, no big surprise. If you're going to increase population, you're going to increase economic development, you're going to increase demand, and animal proteins are a key part of that demand-supply curve. And many people are represented in this room from that sector. But importantly, all the proteins, the animal as well as the plant-derived ones, are important as we think about feeding the people in the world to achieve diets that are basically competitive and desirable on a global basis. Here's a map of just some density, and this is one I'm going to contrast with the next map. You think about where the people are. You see where Australia is there, but if you think about India, China's, your whole Southeast Asia, the density of population is very important to understand. We talk about 7 billion people, but about 3 billion of those people are sitting right here just north of you. You look at the proximity of you to the food source, or for them to the food source. Obviously, Australia is well located from a proximity standpoint, and you do take advantage of that, which I commend you on doing. The other one, though, if you look at it from a productivity or a available food supply standpoint, there's many ways of looking at this. But if you think about where the people are, but you think about where's the land and where's the fresh water to feed the people. Here's just a map that shows in general. Obviously, if you think about the Americas, which is the part we're focusing here, we're very blessed and fortunate to have superb natural resources of land and fresh water, all the way from Canada down into Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay on the south end. So the Americas have a very good, strong natural resource base. Obviously, Asia, you have some certain areas. Australia, every area, here we have good natural resource bases. You have some undeveloped ones probably in Africa, but through the logistics and maybe other issues there, those will not be developed as near term. But you start thinking about where the people are and where the land and water are, and you start saying, how do those marry up on a global basis relative to feeding the people that we have? The other one, and this is just an example of, even if a country has a great natural resource base, depending on their population, they may or may not be able to feed themselves. I had a chance to live in China for about 16 months. I've been there many, many times, as people in this room have probably been. But if you look at China, they maintain self-sufficiency in what they generally call the golden grains, so your corn, rice, and wheat. On the pork side generally, and broiler generally self-sufficient. but also because of limited natural resources, they've strategically made decisions in the dairy sector and the soybean sector many years ago. They will not be self-sufficient. They will be net importers. If you think about their land, what they need to do, you think about the efficiency of production, that actually makes sense if you think about allocation of natural resources. I think that's where Australia is well positioned, as well as the Americas are, on having a natural resource base to supply those needs on a global basis to the countries that need them. Hugh kind of stole my thunder on this one, but I think it's a very critical slide. Hugh, actually, if you think about the U.S., and we pride ourselves on this, is the U.S. has been very aggressive with the innovation and adoption of new technologies. That innovation and technology has allowed us to go from a domestic approach to being global suppliers. I've been involved in the swine industry sector. I've been involved in the dairy sector as they've gone through strategic decision processes saying, are we going to supply for the domestic market, or are we going to supply for the global market? Once those strategic decisions were made, they're going to be a global supplier and not a domestic supplier, because the U.S. only has about 300-some million people. So they said, let's supply 100% of the population instead of 3 to 5% of the population. And that made strategic decisions on how they looked at innovation and adoption innovation, and that results in this output curve. So as much as we have a great resource base, our productivity of that resource base has been tremendous and very important. If you look at self-sufficiency, and this is just pork an example, we could put dairy in here as well, but basically because of that sufficiency, we're major exporters, and if you look at technology innovation globally, those countries that adopt technology innovation tend to be the exporters. In part, it makes sense if you think about those that innovate, those that bring new technology are the ones that are going to have supply available to go into the global marketplace. So I think the U.S. industry has been very proud, the Americas as a whole, of being early adopters of technology, and that's made them self-sufficient and made them have the ability to be globally suppliers to the global marketplace. So it's no big surprise, we think about where the people are, where the products are produced, the evolution of global exports, meat and poultry and dairy, and the U.S. is pleased to be a part of that, as well as the Americas as a whole. I think it's important to kind of think about this is what does that mean if you look at a global map of global food trade? Many times we think of one country, one product, and one flow. Here it shows the interdependence that we have in agricultural trade over the last few years. This just looks at beef, broiler, dairy, pork, and turkey. And actually, we have a live program. I decided not to do that because of the risks of computers these days. But basically, this shows the global agricultural trade of the interdependence of what we have globally. And I think, as Hugh said, if you think about Australia back to the U.S., we're proud we have a very strong relationship with agricultural trade. We leverage each other in that agricultural trade arena. Let's look at this in another way. Really, if you start looking at the origination countries and the destination countries, the Americas are on the top on the origination countries, of which also New Zealand and Australia are in there. The destination countries are a growing list, but really a handful of countries are the ones that produce for the majority of the world when we think about agricultural exports. That's something we need to all keep in mind, Australia as well as the rest of the world, about how we make sure we maintain that ability to produce successfully. Here takes a little bit of a look at the Americas. We've talked about the Americas where we talk on. Here is where the Americas supplies our food on a global basis. So these are the outbound of the Americas if we look about, again, beef, broiler, dairy, pork, and turkey very specifically. If we say, what do we bring into Australia? Here's what the Americans do back in Australia. So you look at key lines there from Canada, the U.S., Brazil, Argentina, and things like that. Then if you look about Australia back into the Americas, also very strong trade. So a strong relationship between the Americas as a whole, U.S. specifically, and Australia. I think then when we say with all that trade, all that interdependence, what do we do? How do we make sure we can operate efficiently in the global marketplace? We're very fortunate, and this has been referenced before, the World Trade Organization develops kind of the rules of trade back in 1994 with the end of the Uruguay round, implemented in 1995. But you look at what the trade was back then, about a little over 45 billion, and now we're at 1.3 trillion. So you think about the rules, the mindset, that was 20 years ago. We developed the rules we're operating under today. And my challenge is, as we think about what we know today versus the future, do we need to keep evolving those rules, like the Doha round and things like that, the TPPs, to figure out how we advance our rules to stay ahead of the trade opportunities, to make sure our rules are facilitating trade while keeping consumer confidence in our regulatory and science-based processes. As noted, the WTO in 1994, established in 1995. What I always look at this as an evolution of trade policy. In the old days, we used to talk about quotas and tariffs. If you think about a lot of the slides here today, we've talked about a lot of quotas and tariffs. The future ones are the sanitary, phytosanitary. So if you think about residues, diseases, and pathogens, that's kind of the future of where the innovation is, but also where our challenges are to facilitate trade as we go ahead. This just gives a little bit of wording of what's involved in the sanitary phytosanitary part of the trade agreements. Basically, members shall ensure that any sanitary and phytosanitary measure is applied only to the extent necessary to protect human, animal, or plant health, is based upon scientific principles, and is not maintained without sufficient scientific evidence. That's important for keeping consumer confidence there, but also facilitating trade. I'd say we need to make sure we're all working together collectively with a common interest in doing that around the SPS issues. Specific to that, ones that we're really trying to think about, and again, countries are doing a lot of the right things in these areas, is basically, if you think about the SPS, is protect human or animal health from foodborne risks, and we're well aware of what some of those things are. Human health from animal or plant-derived diseases, and then basically animals and plants from pests and diseases. So the SPS objectives are very critical, whether you're sitting in Australia or the US or any part of the world, that we truly do have the right objectives that protect the human, animal, and plant health. However, then we need to balance that with how we facilitate trade. The TBT that I've mentioned before, I won't reference those. That's more into how they're implemented and things like that. That's also a challenge. But I'm going to focus on more of the SPS part of it. So the pathogens, diseases, residues. And I'm going to guess most people in this room have heard of between avian influenza, FMD, and BSE. Anybody in this room not heard of those in the trade arenas? Hopefully no hands go up. That's good news. But on the other hand, I think that just personifies the issues that we need to address proactively that are really not so obvious ones. Many of those are not seen. They're more scientific technology. The good news is when the World Trade Organization was established, they did set up mechanisms and process to address these. So we had the quotas and tariffs, but we had the SPS. We even have international bodies that become the trade standards. So the Codex, the OIE, and the IPPC, each of these have their role in facilitating those trade standards. Very important. Codex, basically the one that we spent a lot of time on, Elanco's been very strongly committed to this, is making sure we have global standards for all of our products. Basically based on science, built on trust. This just gives you a sense, if we look ahead, typically we think of quotas and tariffs. This is give a sense of SPS issues, of how they've evolved over the last few years. Yes, there's many cases. This gives you a little bit of a color array of many countries involved by claimant side and many countries by target side, which means probably nobody's perfect in this arena, so we all have objectives to advance this one. But I think this is an arena where we do need to work together collectively. As we look at the SPS issues, a couple key things I always look at on a global basis is what I call those with good intention that naively maybe create issues, those that are out for mischief or protectionism, and to differentiate the two. The first, you really need to work on capacity and capability building. The second one is really what are the barriers and what are the issues that you're dealing with there. We've touched on some of these things about domestic food security, economic issues, food, land, water. In other words, really seek to understand why that barrier is out there and what's driving it. What I will say is we think about those barriers, if we're in agricultural production, if we think about safety and consumer confidence, if we think about human, food, or animal safety, never ever should these be politicized. If anybody ever does this, I think that's to the disinterest of the whole agricultural community. If we think about consumer confidence, that on safety, this should be basically where we follow the science, and I challenge everyone to make sure they take leadership in that role and make sure we're questioning those that don't, because this provides that consumer confidence that's so critical to all of us in agricultural trade. We talked a little bit about trade facilitation and where do we go to look to the future. In the past, we've talked about the equivalency agreements, which are basically more systems endpoint. We've talked about harmonization, which is more aligning around international standards. The mutual recognition, which is really around trade agreements. Each of those is critical going forward and need to maintain. I think with the exponential growth, though, and the new technologies, new innovation, the thing we need to think about is can we more aggressively do what I call standard recognition on a global basis. The current systems in place take time. So can we look at how we recognize standards more immediately than when they're established at a global basis and or at a national basis? Can that be provisionally done, fully recognized in countries' sovereign rights and things of that sort, but how do we set processes and things in place to more readily adopt these international standards or national standards that have gone through a science-based risk assessment process? So I think going to the future, what we really need to do to address these not so obvious barriers is say recognition of international standards via Codex, OIE, or IPPC. Countries such as the US had to change our laws so we could adopt Codex standards. As new countries write laws, can they actually write in their laws provisions to adopt the Codex through international standards? The other thing is, can we proactively recognize other countries' standards on a provisional basis while you maintain your sovereignty, but then also make sure you go through a science-based risk assessment process to adopt those? And as we think about trade agreements and trade standards going forward, this is where we get into bilateral, multilateral negotiations. Can we actually start incorporating language into these agreements that proactively address this? Something to the effect where we oblige countries to follow a standard recognition approaches as long as it's based upon science-based risk assessment efforts. I think that's where we need to go forward, so we're not only looking at the international ones, which may take 5 to 7 years, we can actually look at immediately adopt in other countries. Because in general, if I look at our industry, if we put a human safety package out there for a product, we submit the same package to Codex that we submit to any individual country. So every country really does the basic assessment upon the same human safety package, and that's very critical going forward. So summary, if we think about the not so obvious barriers to agricultural trade, global demand, we've recognized that, increasing population income, productivity and innovation is going to be key to global food security, and so we have to recognize how we scientifically understand that. Agricultural trade will be critical to sustainable food supply as we look at where the people are, where the land and water are. We have good trade rules, but can we take them to the next level? I think that focus around innovation, the SPS side, and basically can we get to standard recognition? So my ask going forward, can we collaborate with government, industry, and consumers to truly expedite how we adopt and streamline our safety standards around trade for trade facilitation and consumer confidence? Thank you.